Hello and welcome to the Risk Assessment, Mapping, and Planning Tool, or RAMP, overview video. In this video, we will demonstrate the RAMP tool and describe how it can be used to plan for public health emergencies. First, the user signs into their account. New users will need to create a new login. Now the user will create or load a session with their jurisdiction of interest. To create a session, click Create Session. First, choose County or Place, and then select your jurisdiction. The user can plan for any county or city in the United States. The user may also plan from multiple contiguous jurisdictions. The data for the selected jurisdiction will now load. A brief demographic overview is provided here, along with an overview of the risk assessment, mapping, and planning modules included in the tool. RAMP will walk through a science-based jurisdictional risk assessment, mapping hazards and population demographics, and hazard-specific planning that's inclusive of at-risk populations. Now we'll begin with the risk assessment module. The risk assessment module of the tool will allow the user, in collaboration with their planning team, to analyze the probability and impact of each individual hazard on their jurisdiction. The assessed impacts to human health include fatalities, hospitalizations, non-hospitalized cases or injuries, and mental health casualties. Healthcare system impacts include the number of hospitals, clinics, long-term care facilities, and dialysis centers available for response. Response and recovery variables include public health, environmental, and command, control, communication, and coordination capabilities of the jurisdiction. The user will evaluate the response capabilities that their jurisdiction currently has, identify the relative probability of each hazard occurring in the jurisdiction, review and adjust the human health and healthcare system impacts of each hazard, and determine how they would like to weight each of those variables in the risk assessment. Finally, the user will review the results in a risk matrix. This page lists all the hazards and associated planning scenarios that will be used in the tool. These scenarios were written to be generalizable worst-case scenarios, applicable to many jurisdictions. The hazards have been grouped into 4 suites: the natural hazards, biological hazards, chemical and radiological hazards, and technological hazards. Now the user can provide some of their specific input into the risk assessment. The user will indicate whether they consider their jurisdiction to be urban, suburban, rural, frontier, or any combination thereof. Then the user and their planning partners will decide if their jurisdiction has the listed public health, environment, and command, control, communication, and coordination capabilities for a response. The responses shown here are for demonstration purposes only. More information is given for each capability by hovering over the blue I button. While most of the planning scenarios are broad enough for most jurisdictions, there are 4 hazards whose impacts cannot be determined by a jurisdiction's location or population size alone, and therefore require the user's input. These tiered scenarios describe small and large impacts of the structure fire, chemical attack, radiological dispersal device, and mass shooting hazards. The user will select between the small and large scenario for each hazard. One element of hazard mitigation involves having a plan or standard operating procedures in place for response. Here the user will indicate yes or no to an existing emergency plan or protocol that would direct the health and medical response for each hazard. When conducting a jurisdictional risk assessment, some group discussion with the user's partners and stakeholders may be necessary to determine the appropriate response. If the user is unsure, they should select No. RAMP uses the concept of relative probability to determine which hazards are more or less likely to occur in the selected jurisdiction over the next planning cycle or the next 5 years. The user will click and drag each hazard from the hazards list into the relative probability list, placing each hazard above or below the other hazards. Placing a hazard higher in the box means the hazard is more likely to happen. Placing a hazard lower on the list means that hazard is less likely to happen. The user may rearrange hazards in the relative probability list at any time. And all of the hazard scenarios are displayed for the user to review. Once the user is satisfied with the order of the hazards, they will click Continue. Now the user can review and adjust the human health and healthcare system impacts of the hazard on their jurisdiction. The health and healthcare system impacts for each hazard were calculated based on a combination of historical events and scientific models. As the user reviews each hazard, they can revisit the planning scenario and see details on how the default values were calculated and the limitations of those calculations. The user now has the option to use the default values or to change the impacts as they feel is appropriate for their jurisdiction. In the RAMP mathematical risk formula, each variable is weighted or assigned a relative value. These weights are agnostic to each hazard, so they are applied to every hazard in the same way. This helps standardize the risk assessment formula so the tool can compare all the hazards in a mathematically sound way. The RAMP tool is pre-populated with weights identified from subject matter experts and stratified by jurisdiction type: urban, suburban, rural, frontier, or any combination. The weights determine how important each variable is in the risk assessment calculation. The user can choose to use the default weights or to customize their weights. We'll walk through an example for customizing weights. When customizing weights, first assign points representing weights to each category of variable. The user assigns points for human health, the healthcare system, and response and recovery. There are a total of 100 points, and all 100 points must be distributed. The user can either type in the desired number of points or use the plus and minus buttons to add or subtract individual points. Once all 100 points have been allocated, the user will click Next to continue. Now the user will assign points to each individual variable. The user may assign as many or as few of the available points to each variable. The larger the point total, the more important that variable will be in calculating the total impact score for each hazard. All points must be assigned across all the variables in the category. Individual variables may have 0 points. In this example, the user would continue to allocate the remaining points to the healthcare system and response and recovery variables, and then continue to the risk assessment results. For demonstration purposes, we will go back to the weighting overview page. If the user prefers to use the default weights, which is highly recommended, then click on the Use Default Weights button. The results of the jurisdictional risk assessment are presented in two ways, the risk matrix on the left and the table on the right. The risk matrix provides a graphical representation of the relationship between each hazard's relative probability of occurrence and the impact score of each hazard on the jurisdiction. The impact score reflects the mathematical combination of individual variable results and weighting, or how bad each hazard will be for the selected jurisdiction. The user may hover over each dot to see the name of the hazard and its corresponding impact score. Hazards appearing in the upper right-hand corner are the most likely to occur and have the largest impact on the jurisdiction. Hazards appearing in the lower left-hand corner are less likely to occur and have a small impact on the jurisdiction. The table lists all the hazards with their impact scores and relative probability rank order. The hazards can be sorted by impact score or by the relative probability rank order. This prioritized list can be shared with executive leadership, partners, and other outside agencies. This concludes the risk assessment module of the tool. Once the user has determined a priority list of hazards, they can select a hazard for planning. They click on the blue map icon next to the hazard to continue to the mapping module. Now the user is in the mapping module. The user may return to this page throughout the planning process to ensure the plan serves the needs of their at-risk populations, that community resources are adequately considered, and any resource gaps are identified. Here, the user sees the population demographics, local resources, and relevant hazard data to help develop their hazard-specific emergency response plans. The map shows the outline of the selected jurisdiction. On the left, the user can select from preloaded demographic layers displayed at the census tract level. All the data seen here were extracted from publicly available state and federal data sets. Click on a census tract to see more specific information about the selected layer. The user can turn on any relevant hazard layers or resources. Click on the point location, such as a hospital location, to see more information about that resource. On the bottom left, the demographic data is also available in a tabular form. These tables are dynamic and reflect the population seen in the area displayed on the map. Once the user is ready to proceed, they'll click on the green Planning button. The user can return to this map at any time throughout the planning process. The user can now move on to the hazard-specific planning module. There are two major components to the planning module. The first component is a heavily researched and curated series of links to planning resources. These include general planning resources, which are useful across hazards. General planning links include FEMA's Community Planning Guide 101 and CDC's At-Risk Behavioral Health Resources, which help coordinate mental and behavioral health response. And we have a link to the HHS Empower data to help plan for the electricity-dependent Medicare population. Finally, hazard-specific planning resources, which include specific tools for planners to use while building out their response plans. The second component of the planning module is a strategic level, hazard-specific, downloadable planning template. These templates provide a basic organizational framework for planners to use while constructing their hazard-specific response plans. These templates contain missions, goals, objectives, and some strategies, all of which can be adjusted by the planner to meet their jurisdiction's needs. When planners and their planning partners have identified their strategic vision for a response, they can operationalize their plan and 1. Identify the services and resources required to mitigate the hazard's impacts, and 2. Identify how to deploy those services and resources so they are accessible to the whole of their community. Now you're ready to continue with your whole community planning process to make better plans to protect your communities from public health emergencies. Thank you for learning more about the RAMP tool.